Fighting games as a genre has always been an uphill battle. It is a genre that is a niche within a niche, with a cost of entry that most people aren't willing to pay. Over the last several years, my beloved game, Street Fighter, was dying, despite it having some of the strongest brand equity, not only in the video game business, but in media in general. 31 years ago, Capcom was able to capture the minds and hearts of an entire generation with their release of Street Fighter 2, which is still their best-selling fighting game to date, by the way, still ahead of newer iterations of the same game. 2010 to 2015 was a dark time for Capcom. This 43-year-old company was seeing a new digital age rise around them. They felt lost and unable to adapt. Despite the headstrong community still holding things together, Capcom was beginning to feel one of their most popular IPs slip from their hand, forced to watch as their competitors pulled ahead in their absence. Look, I didn't mean to get you with the thumbnail. Fighting games aren't dead, but fighting games and arcade culture are dying. They have been dying. And COVID-19 only served to add salt to the wound for the fighting game community. And somehow, perhaps irrationally, I think it's because Street Fighter carries the entire genre on its back. If no one cares about Street Fighter, no one cares about smaller fighting games. Street Fighter 2 was without a doubt the most influential piece of media for its genre, and Street Fighter as a whole still influences the way that fighting games are created today. Despite Capcom being an absolute titan of a publisher, viewership and interest were decaying. So can Capcom dig themselves out of this hole? In this video, we're going to talk about what Capcom is doing for the Street Fighter franchise, and also what it's not doing. Breaking down the numbers from Capcom's 2021 finance report for their shareholders, and I would also like to share a short story about a passionate individual who suffered at the hands of Capcom because it had no faith in its community. So, out of the ashes like a phoenix, Street Fighter 6 hopes to re-earn its championship belt. Well, can it do it? I don't know, maybe.
The previous round. Mistake. He's that salty. Wow. What just happened? Look at this. Come here. Lewis puts the ball up and it just overheads him. Alex Mike. That's it. Tokido is the Evolution 2017 champion coming all the way from loser's bracket. He's done
it! Street Fighter was my first dip into the video game industry, a franchise that I care deeply enough about to invest my time outside of the game to be involved with the community. Just look at the early days of my channel. I clearly thought that Street Fighter was going to be the new Bored Ape Yacht Club. I don't want to go too much into how badly fucked the launch of Street Fighter 5 was and how it killed my interest for content creation in general. I think it speaks for itself. But I will give props to Capcom for still supporting Street Fighter 5 with the release of their Championship Edition in 2020. 4 years after the original release. Yeah. Fighting games, not just Street Fighter, have always struggled with retention and viewership, despite them being explicitly multiplayer and community driven. Take a look at this graph. Okay, take a look at this graph. You don't need to be an investor to know that that's not good. Stagnation is bad enough. A graph like this has investors running out the door. Let's take Dead by Daylight for example, another niche game, which has seen nothing but growth over the past 5 years. For a while, I always thought it was because fighting games were hard and had low accessibility. But taking a break from Street Fighter helped me realize that it was just because fighting games suck. They are not well-made games. I would say that fighting games are still 10 years behind modern video game design. And it probably doesn't help that most fighting games are developed in Japan. Western input need not apply. We as the fighting game community are some of the most cucked individuals in the world, no contest. Long before the ridiculousness of Diablo Immortal and the blatant disrespect of loot boxes from EA and Activision, fighting games were nickeling and diming their customers with locking on-disc content behind a paywall, thirst trapping with overpriced skins, selling digital pixels that are clearly not worth the price tag and removing basic features and selling them back to their dedicated consumers. On top of all that, fighting games often release as bloated, buggy, and bare-bone dumpster fires for the first wave of anxious playtesters to try. Then, 2 years later, it will be repackaged and rebranded as the version you were always meant to play. There is just so much disrespect and lack of faith, from small things like bad netcode, making the online experience a joke, lackluster social systems that sometimes outright don't work, little to no tutorials on major game systems, and a lack of different game modes besides their half-ass put-together jive-ass chicken story mode.
My trapezius muscle, it's your roadside. You can follow it to victory.
Master Zangief.
And worst of all, exposing your computer to a backdoor security risk via a malware-level rootkit. Why does it seem like this genre is always trying to push people out the door? Look, I love fighting games. They are adrenaline-inducing and beautifully complex. What Street Fighter lacks in professionalism and high-budget production, it makes up for it in authenticity and oftentimes pure emotional catharsis. Gameplay is king in this genre, and you don't need big budgets to accomplish that. But it would be naive to ignore the fact that money in the right places is what stimulates growth and success in big companies. Smaller and lesser known IPs are completely supported by a very small but dedicated following. They don't have swimming pools full of cash from huge conglomerates like Warner Brothers for Mortal Kombat and the Injustice series. As a result of that, player retention suffers. Thus, operating budget suffers, and the pool of talent gets smaller. The devs get shittier pay for longer hours, and then they pump out some lackluster story mode with half the roster missing, yada yada, you get the point. And you may say, oh well, it's the biggest IPs that get the most attention anyways, it's not about the content. Well, of course, you can say that for everything. You can say that for things like movies and TV shows. It's just the age-old question of what came first, the chicken or the egg. Do fighting games lack the budget to reach a broader audience because it is unappealing at its core? Or is it the lack of funds to make a good game, which makes it unappealing in the first place? I believe it's a mix of both, but nowadays I'm leaning towards the latter. There are many other mechanically complex games with both single player and multiplayer components where people are pouring hundreds of hours into picking apart. Being hard to learn isn't really an excuse anymore. Street Fighter has to level up. With Street Fighter 6, Capcom has to bring its A game. They have to up the presentation and overhaul its casual game systems for a new generation. Capcom, please do not repeat the failure of a launch that was Street Fighter 5. And oh my fucking god, what the hell happened in Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite? How do you kill a game series with the IP power of fucking Marvel? Jesus Christ, Capcom, you are in the friend zone right now, especially after those tacky ass ads you put in game during matches. A repeat situation with Street Fighter 6 may be the final nail in the coffin for this 35-year-old franchise. So, is Capcom giving Street Fighter 6 the love it deserves? Well, let's find out. Take a look at this graph. What do you see? These are Capcom's highest grossing IPs starting from 2017. Street Fighter ain't on it. Street Fighter is small fish compared to the likes of Resident Evil and Monster Hunter, both of which have spawned Capcom studios in LA, which single-handedly keeps Mila Djokovic employed. But Street Fighter is not a small brand either. It is a $12.8 billion franchise. It has its own line of merchandise, manga, anime, and amusement machines, and even spin-off TV shows and movie adaptations. So, Capcom is doing just fine now in 2022. Stocks have been climbing since 2015, operating budgets are getting bigger each quarter. Although 2010 and 2015 was clearly a bad time for Capcom, sort of a dark age, if you want to call it that. Botched release after botched release, out-of-touch games one after the other. Capcom would see sales plummet to an all-time low. So, the sick joke that was Street Fighter V begins to make sense. Why so much of its asset creation and talent was outsourced to Capcom's subsidiaries instead of being fully built in-house. Why it felt more like a beta test than a finished product. I mean, it's just business. When your company is falling apart like this, it's time to cut the fat and reassess what's important. Street Fighter was on life support during this time, held up by Capcom's more successful ventures. During this time, there seemed to be very little faith for the Street Fighter franchise, from both its fans and its owners. Capcom's fighting game division is a money sink, and it still is in 2022. Capcom seemed to be spending time and effort in all the wrong places. The botched abortion that was Street Fighter V, plus Capcom's bad decision making, had sundered a community apart. On one side, there were people like me who weren't willing to take it up the butt anymore. But on the other side, there were still people huffing on copium. Street Fighter V had shoved its way onto the world stage before it was ready. Ultra Street Fighter 4 had another good 2 years before its esports division would hit its peak. Gross mishandling of funds and poor leadership would ultimately lead to the exodus of many of its passionate fans. Enter the story of Mike Ross.
My name is Mike Ross. I'm 26 years old and I'm from Los Angeles, California.
Mike Ross is most likely only known within the fighting game circle. He used to run Cross Counter TV YouTube channel with his co-host Ryan Gutex Gutierrez, boasting an impressive 159k subscribers, which is not too far behind the official Capcom's Fighter channel at 232k. For me and many others, Cross Counter TV was Capcom Fighter Central before Capcom caught on and started scrambling to do the same thing. Cross Counter TV had its own line of merchandise, it had a good monetization system for their content, made appearances in music videos, and even had an appearance at the White House for some reason. But most importantly, Mike Ross and Gutex had successfully built a small empire within this little corner of the FGC. They were celebrities in their own right. They had fostered a culture, a dedicated fan base, and brand loyalty that Capcom had failed to take advantage of. Their weekly show was arguably one of the only things driving casual interest for Street Fighter 4 from 2011 to 2014. Mike Ross's career would be taken even further in 2014 when he started hosting his own weekly show on Twitch called Capcom Pro Talk, where he would invite various top players and influencers to discuss all things Street Fighter, and most importantly, act as a media front for Capcom's venture into the world of esports. Mike Ross came out of the basement and into the worldwide stage of live streaming. Now, this may sound cheesy, but this guy was living the dream. He was just some kid from SoCal that used to bang his head on arcade cabinets, and now he's making money off of playing video games. Now, I don't know about you Zoomer kids, but trying to make a career out of playing video games was a joke not too long ago. Now, Twitch is pumping out more millionaires than fucking Harvard University. Capcom Pro Talk would draw in thousands of viewers a week, sometimes in the tens of thousands, and it would act as a funnel for all things Capcom Pro Tour. It gave consistent exposure, serving to drive new fans into the Capcom ecosystem. It ran for 2 years and 2 seasons before it was axed by Capcom USA leadership. A waste of time, they told Mike. It wasn't profitable. Fans were left confused to why they would kill a show that was doing so well with increasing interest. Capcom wasn't doing well financially at the time. Maybe it was that. It was just a lack of funds. True tragedy struck when Mike Ross revealed in an interview that he had been paying for the entire show out of his pocket the whole time. So Capcom was not only profiting off of the free publicity for their main product, Street Fighter, the game, Mike was basically just paying them so he could work for them. How was this not profitable? Capcom gets a cut up to $2.50 for each subscriber to their Twitch channel. They got free marketing for their ongoing Capcom Pro Tour, and of course the upcoming Street Fighter V. And Mike would see none of this money. In the end, it wasn't even about the money. It was the culture and community he had cultivated at his expense, which was being snatched out of his hands. He thought that his love and passion for this franchise would earn the respect from Capcom that he deserved. Instead, he got a slap in the face. Profit over community. No shit, Capcom, it wasn't profitable. Do you need a lecture on how to turn market costs into profits? Amazon is basically a glorified boxing company, and now it's winning fucking Emmys. The profits from your marketing is more brand equity, which you got for free off of Mike's back. So, Mike took his ball and went home. And rightfully so, wouldn't you? Capcom would later revive the show under the same premise, but under a different name of Capcom Connect, to gushing reception from its fans. Great feedback like, "Rest in peace, Mike," a charismatic black hole. So Mike Ross doesn't get paid for actually producing good content and these clowns are on payroll? Why didn't you guys pay Mike? Street Fighter V is one of the worst games I've ever played. Mike Ross. Why didn't you guys pay Mike? Mike Ross. Why didn't you guys pay Mike again? Now, I won't speak any more about Mike Ross because I feel like he's the type of guy who wouldn't want you talking about him when he's not in the room. All I'll leave you with is this Reddit comment that was left for him in his AMA. "Hey, I don't know if it's really you, but I'm kind of a lonely guy. No friends. But when I used to watch you and Ryan in Excellent Adventures, it felt like I had two. Thank you for that. And I too thank you, Mike Ross and Gutex, for all the good memories." This story only serves to highlight one amongst many of Capcom's anti-consumer decisions. Much of the goodwill was lost in 2016. Capcom fighters had been left in the dust. Capcom needed to change. They needed to globalize. And in their financial year report, they mentioned a 10-year plan. Leadership was being shifted around. They were doing a push on all fronts: marketing, licensing, operating income, expanding into new countries and more platforms, and bringing a lot of its workforce back to its home country of Japan. Capcom was really feeling the squeeze at this time. They had to either adapt or die in a ditch. And starting from 2017, Capcom would have one of the craziest anime redemption arcs in history. But that's another huge ass video on its own. Hey look, it's me, 2020, and Capcom has milked Street Fighter V Copium boys for all they're worth, and it's time for a new generation of Street Fighter. In summer of 2020, Capcom ousted longtime lead producer and director at Capcom, Yoshinori Ono. So it was clear that, for better or for worse, Capcom is now financially stable enough to go balls in for Street Fighter 6. So is Street Fighter 6 doing the right things to capture back the hearts of old and new fans alike? Maybe breathe in some new life for this old dog? Luckily, the bar is extremely low. We are getting old and cracked out and begging for some new Chun-Li horny jail content. So here are the 5 things that give me hope for Street Fighter 6. Number 1. Street Fighter 6 is moving back home to be fully developed in-house by Capcom. It is also moving from Unreal Engine 4 to their in-house RE engine. So Epic doesn't get a cut of any of this fucking bad boy. And I don't think that we need any further proof that the RE engine is pretty well oiled and makes some character models look gorgeous. Number 2. It seems like Street Fighter V has been taking diligent notes from its younger competitors like NetherRealm for its presentation. Hopefully Street Fighter 6's story will be closer to the production value of Injustice 2 than Street Fighter V. Like hell, Capcom, just bring it in line with the production of your other AAA hits. Stiff voice acting and recycling the same assets and outsourcing your artwork ain't gonna cut it anymore. So bringing all the work back home sounds good to me. Number 3 is also extending an olive branch to its casual players with simplified controls, which of course draws the ire of some of its more hardcore fans. By the way, I am fucking tired of these nostalgia tripping old heads trying to gatekeep on Twitter. They are honestly holding back this franchise. Controls do not make champions, and somewhere deep down you know that. Compromises need to be made for progress. Arc System Works did this for Dragon Ball FighterZ with their auto combo system, and is still a deep and complex game with cool new tech being discovered every month. New fans nowadays are more likely to be playing on a controller rather than a fight stick, and gameplay needs to change to reflect that. Number 4. Capcom is going all out for its single player content. In this IGN Japan interview, the interviewer pondered if Street Fighter 6 was too ambitious, as if they were focusing on too many modes at once, referring to the big plans for the World Tour mode, a story mode which entails RPG elements with a customizable avatar, and open world mechanics more akin to what is essentially an MMORPG. And lead producer Shuei Matsumoto responded that making the game too ambitious was a risk they were willing to take to reach the players they wanted to reach. With the change in leadership around Season 5 of Street Fighter V, it seems like the developers are aiming to work on things that matter for great games in general, changing the art direction and UI back to the hip-hop and graffiti style of Street Fighter III. Number 5. Now this line really resonated with me. The new team aims to recontextualize what Street Fighter means as a brand, to extend it far past the scope of just a fighting game. And that made me so happy to hear. I thought for too long that Street Fighter was just a brand that was being propped up by its IP alone. They are basically admitting that Street Fighter has always had a growth and innovation problem, too stubborn and stuck in the old ways. But now it seems they're combining the presentation of Mortal Kombat, the casual appeal of Dragon Ball FighterZ, and the story-rich single-player content of Soul Calibur, and even taking some of the social features and progression systems from some of the biggest games. And all of this is reinforced by the colossal brand recognition of Street Fighter's $12.8 billion franchise. So, Capcom may finally do it. It's looking good. I remember being there for the gameplay showcase for Street Fighter V at Capcom Cup 2014. And despite the excitement from my peers, I did not think the game looked good. I didn't feel the same way as them. The gameplay looked like it was still in its alpha phase, with a new art direction I wasn't ready to accept. I can happily say I do not feel the same way about Street Fighter VI's gameplay reveal. And I talk about all that in my Street Fighter VI reactions. I may be actually proud of my channel name again. Or maybe it's just the CAPCUCKED fanboy side of my brain speaking. I want Street Fighter V to be the next big thing in esports. I like being part of something big. A game where both the developer and its fanbase can share in the pride. Capcom needs to give Street Fighter the love and care that it deserves. Put some fucking meat on its bones so it can fight its way back to the top, not only above its other competitors, but all games in general. And just to be honest, bro, I just want more casual players so I have more asses to beat, just to keep it 100. Capcom, please take a chance on us, like we took a chance on you, giving us the game that Street Fighter fans deserve. Thanks for watching, and hopefully, I'll see you in Street Fighter 6. If it's good. But knowing Capcom, bro, fuck.